We're recording. So you got that, that's the little bit down there you can see.
Okay.
Might be better here.
But I think that that's just the background. Actually, must have people talking.
Right.
I wonder if we should have that up here rather than looking at my belly.
Kind of got your face.
Mm.
Look. But
what's your? I think it should go up. What do you think, Lois? You can see it. Or Charlotte or anyone who's watching, what do you think?
Or up here. Is that better? Here, yeah, that's pretty better.
I think
cool.
Better.
Done.
Yeah.
How's that? Awesome. Right.
No. Okay. I think I think we're going to get started. Thank you, virtual world, for putting up with this. Thank you, people who've turned up physically to this. I'm Ingrid Young. I'm one of the co-chairs of IRESH. Thank you for coming to our very first IRESH lunchtime seminar / experiment with technology. We decided as a group that we thought it might be a way to pursue some of our IRESH aims to bring people together, not for super long, because half a day sometimes or a full day can be quite a commitment, but actually we want to facilitate ways to bring folk together from different parts of Scotland, from different sectors, to be able to talk to each other about our research and the kind of issues that we're quite concerned about. So today our seminar, or our discussion really, is about sexual health research in, with, for, or by communities, so exploring ethics and ethical practices in community-based research. I'm going to start off with a couple of questions, and then I'm going to introduce the speakers to you. We've got 3 speakers today. We're starting with Ruth McKenna from Waverley Care. We'll follow that with Emma Jackson from Glasgow Caledonian University, and then we'll follow up, last but not least, with Nicoletta Polacek from HIV Scotland. And we have, for those of you out there and even in the room if you're shy, we have a hashtag you can send questions into. Again, this is all an experiment, so please be nice on the hashtag with your questions. And really, we want this to be probably more of an informal discussion than a very formal presentation. As most of you who know me, I'm not very formal, and most of the things I organize aren't very formal, so I think hopefully we can stick with that. One of the reasons we came up with the topic for the lunchtime seminar, actually it came out of a discussion I've been having with a number of people, but Ruth McKenna in particular, was about how do we do research if you are outside of an academic institution. What does that mean? What are the ethical implications? How do you do that? And I think actually it raises a number of questions about not just people who are not in academic institutions doing research, but actually how research is done more broadly in a community setting with communities. So I think we came up with a title because there are a number of ways you can do research, where research can be done. The research in communities, what does that mean? Are you situating yourself in a community? Research with communities, are they research partners? Who exactly are we talking about as stakeholders? Research for communities, what is the aim of the research, and what's the best way to do that? Is it to present communities with research? Is it to work with them to enable better health and well-being for communities? And research by communities, who should be doing the research? What sort of research should they be doing, whoever they are? And how do we best support that and address kind of what's the best research to answer the questions that we need answered, that we want answered? I'd also like to problematize what we mean by community. That perhaps is a whole other session, but I think we need to keep this in mind as we're talking about community research or research in communities. We use community to pay attention to how that's being used and how we're deploying community, and how some people speak for communities, some people speak from communities. And I think we need to be very careful about what assumptions we're making and how that shapes the research questions we're doing, how that shapes the research relationships that we have, and how that shapes how we talk about community-based research. So that's all I'm really going to say. I'm going to hand over to our next speaker, Ruth McKenna from Waverley Care. She's the Research and Engagement Manager, I think. We don't have any slides. We're doing this old school, so you'll have to listen to us and enjoy our lovely faces. So I'm going to hand over to Ruth now. Thank you.
Hi everyone, and hi to any viewers on the camera. So yeah, as Ingrid said, I'm Ruth McKenna and I'm the Research and Engagement Manager at Waverley Care. I take it everyone knows who Waverley Care are. I don't need to introduce this. Okay, so my role is Research and Engagement Manager, and my post and the post that I line manage are funded under the third sector funding stream that's associated with the sexual health and bloodborne virus framework. So my job is really to carry out research and engagement with people who are affected by or at risk of poor sexual health and bloodborne viruses. So I've only been in post for about 5.5 months, so it's a new role in the organisation, and I'm new to the post. So as Ingrid said, this seminar for me kind of came from a discussion we had earlier in the year around doing ethical research when you're not based in an academic institution. So my background was in academia. I finished my PhD, thank you, at the beginning of the year, and was involved in other research projects through that, so was used to having to go through a process of ethical approval before doing research. But this role in Waverley Care is also now my third role in a charity doing a research role. And what struck me in I suppose my first post in a third sector organisation was that there was comparatively little ethical oversight compared to if you were doing research in a university or even in the NHS or recruiting participants through the NHS. Obviously, if you're working in partnership with an academic or working in partnership with another institution like the health service who have their own ethics procedures, then that's one way for third sector organisations to show some form of ethical oversight. But research often takes place when it's maybe just a researcher based in the organisation and happens without that process. So for example, in a previous post, I managed a peer research project, which to me seems potentially risky because it's kind of involving peers in research and there's different risks associated with that. And although there was a kind of ethics checklist to go through, the organisation had an ethics checklist, there wasn't really like a process to then review the issues that checklist flagged, which were around working with peers in research and also some of the issues that were going to be raised during the interviews. So coming to work in Waverley Care, and given that it's a new function in the organisation, I was quite keen that going into that we do make sure the research we're doing has some form of oversight beyond me. So really what I'm looking for is myself to have some kind of oversight of the work I'm doing. And I think that the kind of previous post I was in, it was a very big organisation and that it wasn't possible to make that kind of structural change. But I think the nature of Waverley Care is such that it's an organisation where we could potentially introduce some kind of internal ethical structures, and it's flexible enough to sort of have those changes. So Ingrid and I had a chat about this earlier in the year and decided that it would be good to have this kind of seminar to get other perspectives on what if other people have experience of doing research in the third sector and how you make sure that's ethical. So kind of the key issues I see, or I guess in my opinion, the key issues around ethics for a researcher in the third sector, first of all, are around how you define research when you're working in a context where there's a lot of service evaluations taking place. So how do you extrapolate what research is from a service evaluation? Because service evaluations often look like research, so it will be surveys, interviews, maybe observation. But obviously staff need to be able to do that without going through a kind of laborious process of getting ethical approval. But at the same time, I think there can be elements of evaluation that kind of stray into research. So people might use a survey to evaluate a service, but then at the end of that survey, we'll ask questions that are actually gathering sort of like knowledge that could be generalised about maybe past experience of trauma, that don't relate to explicitly the service they've received in the past. And I know in the kind of NHS ethics committee, that's how evaluation and research is differentiated around whether it refers to a service in the past or kind of general experiences or the future. But I think making that boundary clear to people that have never gone through an ethics process before can be really tricky. I think there's also a challenge around working with people to kind of contemplate the broader spectrum of harm that can result from research. So not thinking about harm just as physical harm or even somebody getting upset, but that kind of balancing of even someone taking 15 minutes out of their day to fill in a survey, if that survey is, not going to go anywhere, it's going to be of no benefit to them. So that process is kind of, which I think is integral to ethics, like kind of going through an ethics committee process, is weighing up the benefit with the potential harm, or even the time the person has to take to work with you as a researcher. One of the other issues I think, which I'm increasingly troubled by, is around peer research. And I've done peer research in the past and managed peer research, and I'm looking at ways to involve peers in research just now. But I think one of the difficulties around peer research for me is that I'm a salaried researcher, and if I'm working with peer volunteers to do the research that I'm paid to, I find that a kind of tricky ethical area. I think the solution is that peers should probably be paid if they're involved in research in that way, rather than because someone is, in this case, living with HIV. I don't think that means that they should then be expected to do research on HIV for free when I'm kind of getting paid to. So I think there's something complex there around that. And also the kind of, I think there's issues around trauma and peer research that it depends what the topic's on, but if peer researchers aren't kind of well supported and are just sort of slung into that without any support mechanisms, I think that needs to be considered. So both with paying researchers and then peer researchers, and also looking at how they're supported, that both raises kind of resourcing questions, which if you're in the third sector can be really difficult to resolve. Some of the other issues, and I imagine this will come up for most third sector organisations, is around students and how you deal with student requests to access, in our case, service users, and how we kind of make decisions about whether students should be allowed to do that or not. I feel like if students are coming into the organisation, it should be reciprocal, and it should be clear to us from the outset what the organisation will get from that research, how it will be communicated, and I think it should be more than a copy of their dissertation that they then have to sort of trawl through. But also the knowledge should be kind of, it should go over and above that, that perhaps the researcher comes back to talk to the people who took part in the research about what the research found out. And actually, ideally, we should be involved right from the outset, because I think what we find is students come with questions that are very set, and they just don't, they're often really interesting, and especially like if they're framed well theoretically, they can be of interest, but from an organisational perspective, they're just not, to us, worth staff spending the time to be involved in that, or to kind of work with the people they support to get involved in the research. I think the final issue, and it kind of relates to this, is around gatekeeping and the relationships that service delivery staff have with the people they work with, and also the relationships that I'll potentially develop with the people who use our services. And that was certainly something that arose in my previous role, where again I was kind of embedded in an organisation, and I would be doing research with people who, just by virtue of being in an environment that they were accessing support in, I would kind of overhear things or maybe see something or notice something in the database. So I'd be privy to more information about them than they necessarily told me in the research interview. And I kind of responded to that by making clear when I was writing up research that I was only including exactly what I'd been told in the interview, and not information that I might have kind of picked up elsewhere. But I think that kind of, when you're a researcher embedded in a context with people you're going to be then potentially working with to do research, it's quite difficult to draw the line about where the information you know about them has come from, and just making sure that how you're using the information. And obviously being embedded in that way can be really beneficial as a researcher, both in terms of the relationships you develop with staff, who are then able to sort of put you in contact with people that might want to be peer researchers or research participants. But nevertheless, it can be problematic. And I think actually even using staff as gatekeepers, my colleagues, can be problematic, because they have a particular relationship of trust with people, and it's, I suppose, how I negotiate that can be tricky. So I feel like I've just kind of given a big list of things that I'm not sure about, or kind of conundrums rather than any answers to anything. But I do think ethics is, there aren't any fixed answers. I think it often is just a process of internal wrangling, and I suppose I saw my role in this seminar is to do that publicly in front of you all. But I think kind of talking with other people and finding out about other people's experiences is probably, it's hopefully going to yield some solutions, or at least ideas for kind of practical solutions. So that was kind of what I was quite keen to hear from people is, I mean, I'm really interested in ethics from a theoretical perspective, but I suppose my what I hoped would come from the seminar was more around actually practical steps that potentially organisations could take to make the research that's done ethical, but in a way that doesn't kind of impede the day-to-day running of the organisation, doesn't impede staff's ability to carry out evaluations, but produces research that's of a standard and is of a standard that could potentially be publishable because it's been rigorously ethically reviewed. So I think that's all I had to say. Thank you for listening, and thank you to anyone on the camera.
I'm going to suggest that we don't let me introduce. For those of you who didn't hear that, we're going to have questions at the end or a discussion at the end. I'd like to introduce now Eva Jackson, who's at Glasgow Caledonian University.
Oh, you can't see. I thought maybe I had a wee, oh, I do have a wee screen up there. Good. All right, well, thanks very much for inviting me, Ingrid, to talk again about some of the issues to do with community engagement. I think just first to explain about a wee bit about, it's quite funny because when I start talking about this, I'm actually just often talking about me in a more personal way than actually I really like to. But I'm going to try anyway again today and articulate this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my own work and about myself and how I work within academia. The way I work, to me, is really important, and it has grown out. I am a Black female academic working in Scotland and working largely in isolation, and most of my career has been in isolation from other Black female academics in Scotland, though I have obviously networks in the rest of the UK and the world. And how that experience is manifest is actually, and I work with communities of colour, and how that experience, what's happened within that experience, has really affected how I work as a researcher and feeds into a lot of the issues that you're talking about from an organisation. I guess it is me in an organisation too, but it's also how I'm positioned within that organisation. So I'm sort of basing this in a project I'm doing at the moment. I have worked with Waverley Care, with the African Health project there, and that was a specific way of working with them. But this project I'm talking about is actually related to women, communities of colour who are experiencing FGM, or from practicing communities, female genital mutilation. And so this kind of project work that I'm talking about here is related to that. So I think what we're working on is really important, and I think it is sort of work that I work with this community has actually come about in a broader context around community engagement, around the need to sort of decolonize the work that we're doing in academia. The work that I focus on with my community engaged research is about whiteness and about the workings of power within the academy and how that plays out in research, in teaching, and actually in the use of the university itself, the spaces that it has, the campus, the resources that it has, and the collective potential we have with all that to actually work for the communities that we are ostensibly here to serve. So the type of engagement work and research and teaching in the university as an entity in itself is, in my view, fundamental to us actually maintaining the social fabric of our lives, about how we engage with this research from now, and as our understanding has grown about how we behave to the communities broadly, and even with the best of intentions, that we have to really look at this in this wider political moment around what is happening about institutions who have power over people's lives. Although I have a clinical background in health, I work broadly in migration, but actually my research and the community and my community engagement work is about the process of engagement with communities of colour in research and policy. And this way I work across sectors. I work in health, I work in the cultural sector, I work in employability and in education. And it is in the process of community engagement in research and within policy that I evidence through my own research. So the way I work with community has, as I said, has come out of the reality of my experience of being a Black academic in Scotland. I'm one of the very few working with marginalised communities of colour who is a person of colour in Scotland. In Scotland, there's been significant demographic changes over the last 20 years. Our population is just about not falling. It's very bad for the future and for our economy. But politically, the narrative and the rhetoric here is not so broadly anti-migration like the other administrations within Britain and in the US. So we've had, for the last 10, 15 years, sort of sustained in-migration into the country, which is historically a country of out-migration. We strongly voted against Brexit. I'll explain how all this impacts on my work, but we have a nationalist party in government who has its manifesto a call for Scottish independence. So irrespective of what we individually feel about these issues, we are living and working within this social political climate. And migration is a relatively new field in Scotland, and community engagement is a growing interest in universities. Our university in particular, who's branded it as itself as a university for the common good, but also around the issue of community engagement for REF, for showing impact, and what that all means. So here I am in a university proactively aligning itself with those from communities who are marginalised, often in poverty, or to do with sexuality, to do with the demographic changes. And as these demographic changes, increasingly this is about communities of colours and migrants. But my particular interest is about how those who are marginalised and furthest from the academy, as a user of the actual resources of the university, are increasingly becoming the target of the research undertaken with the academy, and which increasingly demands evidence of some form of impact related to their engagement with the university. So I work, so what did I do? Basically, I situated myself over the last 10, 15 years very much with the communities as a kind of, I was not an activist, but I situated with the community as I learned about what they were trying to experience, trying to articulate through their activism, through their groups that they met, that they worked with. And I worked with them to, perhaps it wouldn't be developing my own research proposals. I would use my energy and my time to support them to articulate their own experiences. And the reason what I kind of got from this, because people were saying, like, well, why did you do all that? That doesn't impact hugely on your academic career. And it doesn't. But I felt it was really important because I didn't want to, I knew that the way that the system was working was not working for me personally. And so then for me to then use that system to come and repeat it with the community I am ostensibly there to support, which is communities of colour in Scotland, well, I wasn't going to work like that because it's not working for me anyway, so it's unlikely to work for you. So then I just decided to work with the way that they wanted me to work with them. So I spent time, my kind of academic time, my intellectual thought was spent supporting communities to articulate what their experience. Your issue about who is community, for me, it's really straightforward because it's communities of colour. So I don't really mind how they come to me. They'll come towards me, which is another important point. I'm not there seeking, they're just come to work because they need support to manage this field, which is academia, the academy, the research, the teaching. So I'm less interested, I guess, in the issues around who is community. To me, it's communities who self-identify, people of colour who want support, really. So I use the academic and the academic expertise in order for them to develop up and to seek funds, which your point, communities are paid as experts. Again, that was something that really impacted on my own ability to apply for funding, because there's so few funds. It's actually happening a lot more now, because I think the issues are starting to be understood. But when it was really hard for me if I didn't want to work with, work on, work for. But actually, I'm being paid your work. So it was hard. So often I actually became the one who wasn't paid, so that they would develop up a project and I would do a little bit of research about their experience to support that project. But I was the one who wasn't paid, so because my time would go into supporting them get their funding for their own project proposal. But now there are actually more fundings available, that you not only have time, that the community is paid as an expert in their experience, but also that you can have a bit of time to work out, are you going to be able to work together? And again, that was something I decided I needed to do, but I just did it in my own time, ostensibly. But now there's a recognition that you need to form those relationships in order to take forward the research in a way that is of benefit, of interest, of value to that community. And so you can't just make that happen in a relationship. You can try, but it's really hard. To be honest, it's really hard even when you have that time, and there's lots of issues within it. But also another down of that is that all that effort and all that work, I don't have time really to write papers. I write reports. I write reports for government, I write reports to their funders, I write reports to policymakers. So I'm not really, because the power for the community and the power that is decision-making power around their lives is not in academia or papers, it's actually policy. So my focus has really been on policy, which again does not play out hugely well in your own academic career. So what I did notice about all this is that how little I actually, because I was saying it was often to do with migrants, but what I did realize is that it's how little I understood their experience, even though I was situated, even the amount of time and amount of work it took me to understand what they were talking about, even though I thought when I went towards their issues. And I realized, how on earth have we been doing work around these issues if me, who comes with all this kind of effort to try to understand their experience and articulate that, and I come away feeling I have not got a clue how that actually is for that community. And even though I'm researching, so it humbled me. I was like, really knew how much work there is to do and what we've been doing. So the other thing I wanted just to say about, you raised it as well, about being safe for the community. I think I spent quite a lot of time, not just about my own practice. I'm fairly confident that the community might not always agree with me. In fact, sometimes they don't, how safe I am, they are with me. But actually, a lot of my work would be to support them understand what sort of organization they are going to be safe working with. Because so many, and particularly now, so many organizations are going towards community to try to do research, to demonstrate impact. And so they're saying, asking me, well, what do you think of that organization? How do I rate them? And I support them with that, because it's a really difficult, and potentially these things are harmful, particularly, I've got to say, is because around communities of colour, because most of the people researching them are not people of colour. So in Scotland, and that doesn't necessarily play out, I mean, it does play out in the world, but it's particularly acute here. So that's kind of what I do. I think right now, the issues that you're raising, I'm raising, I guess, and I worked strategically. I've got there's a lot of thinking going on around this. So I think I really welcome the opportunity to share and have a chat and hear perspective, because funders are talking about this, policymakers are talking about this, universities talking about this, and because I mean, my fear obviously within this, and historically this is likely to play out, the communities will suffer in this renewed interest in their perspective, which before, when I was maybe 10 years ago doing this type of work, I was really fighting to be able to do this type of work, and nobody really understand what I was on about. You know, like, what do you mean you? And nowadays, everybody's kind of understanding it. It's a whole different kind of shift, and I think I worry a wee bit for the communities in that, and what we kind of are doing with in that. So there we go. That's a bit of an insight into the kind of way and some of the thinking behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. That was great to hear. I'm going to introduce our last speaker before we get on to discussion. But Nicola Polachak is the chair of the board for HIV Scotland, and I think has other titles too. But I will let her introduce herself. So, Nicoletta, please.
Thank you. Right. Yes. So I'm kind of very lucky to be the last person. After two very interesting speakers, because I want to introduce myself in a different way first, as associate professor, very much obsessed with ethics. I sit on the ethics committee at my university. I'm the ref lead for sociology in my institution. So everything to do with community impact, ethics, and everything that other people might find slightly boring, that's me. Except that, as the title I was going to give to this presentation, which is about the colonized space of research around sexual chaos. Because I am a woman living with HIV, my positioning is completely different all the time. And my questioning is very much about where is the community, who is the community, when and how do you represent the community. So I just want to kind of my presentation originally, because I didn't have really a sense of what we were supposed to be doing, so it was much more formal with beautiful, well, kind of nice looking slides and funny pictures and everything else. But I think it's much more useful that I tell you something about myself. Starting from belonging to communities, I am a migrant. I came to the UK because I actually didn't even know where Scotland was. I got a research grant, a huge amount of money in those days, 1991, to do a piece of work on women in prison. And I ended up doing my PhD at Edinburgh University, looking at the relationship between the sex industry and HIV through policing. I am by my own default a criminologist, but I'm very much interested in the criminalization of any sexual activities or anything to do with sex. I absolutely love sex, and I love talking about sex, and anything to do with sex I find it particularly fascinating. But again, I go back to the community bit. Since 1991, I had the opportunity to be part of so many different communities. I start with being involved with historically, I was involved with since the very beginning, the international community of women living with HIV and AIDS, amazing community of women, the biggest women's caucus at the UN. At one point, we were massive. We did amazing things. I worked on an amazing project, which was Voices and Choices about reproductive rights for women living with HIV and AIDS, advocating specifically for the rights of women not to have children as a choice, not as a tragedy. And that was quite controversial in those days, believe you me. And I work with communities of women in so many different countries, from Zimbabwe to Ireland, the Ivory Coast, and without boring you too much with my CV, I really traveled everywhere to meet women and communities. And my question was, since then, really, I'm not representing any community. because everyone is completely different. Everyone has a unique story, much more important than mine. As much as I want to sell, and sometimes I do sell, my HIV story as very glamorous one, and I want to be glamorous, and I want people to feel that my HIV is special. It's absolutely not special if I compare myself to the woman next to me, because her HIV is equally special. By saying this, I'm saying that when I talk and I do write and I discuss, and then Ruth was with me only last week, I think, when I was talking about margin not being a safe place. We are, as community of people living with HIV, and I've got a big thing about defining community, and I will tell you this in a minute. I strongly hate with passion the word community. And I'll tell you in a minute why, but I want to go back to the sharing the space at the margin. People living with HIV are always at the margin. But within that margin, we have not a shared space. My work has been very much around sex workers and sex workers living with HIV and women living with HIV. And my research, my most recent research has shown, for instance, that women living with HIV do not particularly like sex workers living with HIV. I'm not even mentioning issues about stigma, discrimination, stereotyping, and labeling, which we all know about. What I'm saying is that, again, if you think about the notion of the community of women living with HIV, already you can see, and you're coming with me, there is no community as such. And I'm only giving you a very short snapshot of what community would be. Then again, as much as I want to praise myself as some young-looking woman, I've been living with HIV since 1982, so I'm old because of my age, but also because of my experience of having HIV. So I belong to the category of the old ones, which is particularly a category that, believe me, I hate. I want to be young-looking and think and be like a young person, which is already stereotyping and putting me in a community where I don't want to belong. I don't want to be in the community of those who are old for many different reasons. I want to be always in the community of the young, good-looking, glamorous ones. So that is not the community of HIV is not my community already. Also, I'm an academic, and I worked my way through from being a job in lecturer to being an associate professor and soon to be a full professor. And has been hard work for everyone who is in academia, but particularly for someone who has been open about their status, because I had the experience of being told so many times, okay, you're very good at what you're doing, but you're open about your status and don't belong to the community of academics. And that's fine. And I get it, I understand. And that's very true. I'm not even talking about discrimination or feeling sorry for myself. That's not the point I want to make. The point I want to make is that we can jump into different communities all the time without belonging to any community. And particularly when we think about HIV, the HIV community, there isn't such a thing as the HIV community. Hence, my argument would be that when we talk about research with communities affected or infected by HIV, like we could argue, and I challenge you to disagree with me, everyone is affected by HIV because HIV does exist. So we're all part of one community, irrespective of gender, age, nationality, ethnicity, and so forth. So already we're a big community. But each of us, even in this room, we have different locations, different positioning. And then I can talk about situated knowledges if you want me to be more properly academic. But in one way or another, within the community, within this big circle of people affected by HIV, we all position ourselves differently. Hence, we don't have the same power. And power within communities is something that I'm particularly passionate about because, and now I'm moving to the community of people living with HIV. I have much more power than other women living with HIV because of my academic status, because of my ability to be here and talk to you. the majority of women, and I don't mean that in a patronizing way, the majority of women live with HIV because they have children. Luckily, I don't have children, and that was my choice. It wasn't a tragedy. I made the choice not to have children because I wanted to have an academic career. And I felt that children were interfering. Also, so my personality. Will, that knows me very well, knows that, me and children. But not because I'm not a caring person, just because I'm just not that person. And I don't want anyone to judge me on this, although there is always a judgment or a sort of opportunity to make allowances when we want to position women living with HIV. There is a part of us that always feel sorry because there are women living with HIV. And I do feel sorry for other women living with HIV that are allegedly part of my community because they don't have a voice. And the point I want to make, if there is only one point that I get today, is that I cannot and I don't want to speak on behalf of any other woman living with HIV because my position, my voice is only mine. And that should be like that. The fact that I am the chairperson of HIV Scotland doesn't mean anything in terms of how I position myself and how women can be positioned, except that maybe somehow, somewhere in a parallel universe, other women can think that it's quite safe to be open about their status, or can they disclose their status, and that would be quite useful. But it's also equally good not to disclose the status, and that's fine as well. The point, and I think it's quite an important point, for me, is the relationship between those who want to do research with us and those who want to do research about us, and those who are asking us to become peer researchers. I hate with a passion someone who is asking me, you can ask me, I do hate when someone is asking someone to become a peer researcher because they have something, in this particular instance, HIV. But I can give you another example which would be equally fitting because I'm very passionate about migration. I'm a daughter of a refugee and I'm a migrant in this country, and since Brexit, although I didn't want to talk about Brexit, but here we go. Since Brexit, I even feel more of a migrant, despite the fact I've been here since 1991 and I have no intention to leave Scotland unless I'm asked to leave, but that's another story altogether. Being a peer researcher and being asked to be a peer researcher is very much about what you both said about, involving the community. But what kind of community do we want to involve? We want to involve, I'm talking about women specifically, we want to involve middle class white women who can be easily turn into a peer researcher, because maybe the majority of women living with HIV are not middle class. I'm just putting something here. Or should we want to start involving those who are usually defined as people who have a chaotic lifestyle? Because those maybe are those who are never represented. Except that when I'm writing a paper or when I'm submitting the research piece, my lifestyle is very chaotic because I'm in my pajamas for days. I don't answer the phone. Luckily, my partner is very good, so he does everything. So my life is just focusing on my paper, so even more on my research piece. So from the outsider point of view, my life could be defined as very chaotic because I don't even know when I'm supposed to have lunch or dinner if I'm really. And that's what other people would define a chaotic lifestyle when they're patronizing people who are using drugs, for instance. And I can carry on this. Going back to the peer research point, which again, something particularly close to my heart, because people are asking me all the time to be a peer researcher. So when I start answering this question, when I make the decision if I want to be a peer researcher, I always feel compelled that the majority of people, I didn't do that with Ruth because the relationship was completely different, to list my academic achievement. and list all my degrees, my PhD, and everything I have done, in order to make sure that the person in front of me understands that maybe I don't want, or I don't perceive them as my peer, academically speaking, if that makes any sense. And that's quite important when we go back to what we have been discussing much more in length, which is about why do we want to make, or rather, I'll rephrase the question. Do we need to involve people, and I'm being very provocative for the purpose of generating a conversation or other discussion. Do we want to involve people in people from the community in the research? Because some people in the community I allegedly represent cannot be bothered, don't want any research done on them. They want something else. We make assumptions all the time about the community. Then I'm kind of jumping to something completely different. My presentation was much better organized, trust me. But I want to say something else, which is specifically about the relationship between non-profit organizations and ethics. I think because specifically, and I'm saying this from the perspective of someone who has been sitting in the ethics committee almost all my academic life, I think that specifically non-profit organizations should have a much stricter way of dealing with ethics. I can probably spend hours talking to you about the amount of time people approach me from different organizations or from the NHS and ask me, because I'm a person living with HIV, if I wanted to be part of the research. There was not even, apart from half a page, when maybe sometimes I had to sign a consent, but there was nothing remotely close to explaining to me. And again, I said earlier, and I'm repeating this on purpose, I sat on ethics committee almost all my academic life, so I know exactly how to deal with withdrawing consent, at what time, and everything else that goes with the formation of a full research proposal, which has to go through ethical approval. It doesn't happen most of the time, because I understand that organizations have other ways of dealing with funding, with time, with skills, but we're still people. So I don't get it. And, I'm still the same person, and I still deserve the same amount of time in someone drafting a proper list of papers. I still want someone to explain to me in the language that I'm able to understand. Again, and I'm repeating this, I can understand the language because I sit on ethics committee. But not every woman sits on ethics committee, and they shouldn't, because it's bloody boring. It's not compulsory, but no one makes the effort. The amount of time the NHS has approached me in so many different capacities, researchers from the NHS, to do research about, I love this, aging, specifically, which is quite topical at the moment, without explaining so many things that you would explain if the person in front of you is not an HIV person, but is someone with another issue altogether. I want to finish because I really want more a discussion as well as me talking as much as my voice. But the final point, and I want to kind of leave with this, is that I really hate the word community. And I want, because it's not representative and it's putting us in so many small clusters, and it's very difficult. If you put me in one community, it's very difficult for me to make the jump and go to the academic community where I want to belong, or the academic, from the academic community moving to the community of women who are migrated to the UK. It's absolutely hellish to be in so many different communities if you put me in those communities. But I cannot be in one big community. So it's the word community that I love, but also the fact that we use community as a kind of very caring and embracing umbrella term to define everyone who's living with HIV. Then, and I finish on this because I'm passionate about this, when we talk about community, we make the assumption that somehow the community has a kind of, there's a masculine connotation to the word community. It's never really about women, it's more about men and subsequently women. And I leave you with this.
Thank you. That's quite a point to leave us on. I'm going to open this up to the room. I'm not going to attempt to answer any of the questions that the three of you have posed or challenges. I'm wondering if we should turn the computer around.
Yeah.
I'm going to, for those of you watching us still, I'm summoning the IT support, otherwise known as...
Yeah, me. Yeah, it could be a roving IT. Let's see how that works.
One thing that struck me while we were talking was that we've just made assumptions, or maybe we haven't made the assumptions, but you haven't talked about it, and I'm making it. But the communities understand what research is. And when we say we're going to go and do research on a community or with a community or whatever, that everybody has the same understanding of what research is. I've found my own experiences that a lot of people don't. Or people who think a researcher is going to come to talk to you, they're going to ask you to fill in a survey, and that's that kind of market research type can tick some boxes. So I think in a way we need to go back one step further from this in terms of doing research in with or by communities to say, do we make sure that the people we want to work with or for know what it is we're actually doing? Because often, I think we get in this academic bubble, we all talk to each other and we know what we mean. And I'm including third sector in that kind of bubble. We understand the purposes of research, we understand what it does, how it happens. But out there in the wide world, an awful lot of people they don't know.
It was funded capacity building community who are affected by FGM and schoolgirls to learn about research, respond to policy, and being able to be capacity built to respond because they are hurt. So this fear that I have of what's going to happen increasingly with communities, so I guess some of the project is about developing. So that's what the funding was for the community to have funding to be supported, take their own learning over the last year in order to respond to exactly what you're saying. So whether they sort of educational program that happened a year with them to learn about research, to learn about policy, to learn about how that impacted in their lives, for exactly the reason that you're saying. That how do we know what they know about it? And yes, it's impact on their lives all the time, and they're having to take back from it. Nearly all the time, we have to get funding for themselves. So it's really, I guess, the research I'm doing is about those dynamics and bringing them into a research project in order to support the community to respond to the policy or research academy who's coming, might be coming for them.
Yeah.
But with the best intentions.
Yeah. So is colonialism, right? So no.
Can I just go back to yourself about this kind of disconnect? As another member of the HIV community, which I have to insist is entirely male-based. That's my opinion, however. People don't understand. They don't understand. There's a nice little bubble of community, and I represent those with HIV. who are MSM, but then, as Nicholas has said, I also belong to lots of other communities as well. There's just that slight disconnect of the nice bubble of academia. We don't get it. We know that clever people do clever things, but we don't. What I'd like to see is a meaningful end to it. What does it do for the community? What does it do for me? What does it do for the wider community of those accessing health services or HIV services? That's where we're kind of lost. And trust me, I think in the 7 years I've been back in Scotland since I've been since I joined my clinic, I don't know how many pieces of paper I've filled in, and it doesn't mean anything to me. I'll fill it in and say, there's my demographics. Yes, no, thanks, no, yes. And if there's any other information like that, I can't be bothered. So there's that's how people view research, because it's market research. Totally bona fide. This is another card. Can you fill that in for me? There's a disconnect to see what happens at the end of it. Because nobody tells us what happens at the end of it. That's why
Ruth's point was important when you were talking about students. I think we need to widen that as well. If you're going to give something to students, it is access to people so they can get a distinction. There should be something to bring back to those people to say, right, you gave us all this information, here's something for you.
Yeah.
Instead of being, I'm very concerned about, as a researcher, being someone who takes stuff from people. I take people's stories and I turn them into a thing that, like Eva was saying, kind of will help me to have a career amongst them. But it needs to be more, research needs to be much more than that. And we do need to give something back. That's Ruth's point is really important.
I think we're lacking about actually where the system work is there. But what to me is really important is because generally the communities I work for and with the organisation, they don't feel safe at all with the structures haven't been built for them. They're not in it anywhere. And yet they're being policied about and researched about, but they're not. So whether the extreme of that makes it really clear where my own ethical moral stance towards what's happening plays out. Now for others in this world where you have your own kind of situation, whether it's peers, what you're doing, you may have more movement. But I have such for me, I have such a little space to move for because it's so damaging generally. What happens? There isn't an issue. So
one more pragmatic issue that I wanted to bring up, and that was really related to what you were saying about this issue of students, is we have had quite a nice example, which was a collaboration between us and EMA and Waverley Care. So one of our master's students, who is, well, what's your phrase that you want me to use? Community of colour. Yeah, she's African. She's African. Yeah, and so she kind of came. She wanted to work with people of migrant Africans here. So she come up with her research project, and that was what she wanted to focus on. I think it was originally she was saying she wanted to interview young HIV positive women who were mothers. I think that was what her original idea was. And we were saying, well, actually, Waverley Care is a great organisation to work with. And when we spoke to Waverley Care, they were like, we're not really that interested in that group. What we're really interested in is older women who are HIV positive. And so she changed her research focus completely and said, well, actually, this is what we need to be doing, And I want that, for me, is ideal and exactly what we want to be doing. And I would really welcome that, not just, and even from the point of view, if there's stuff that you want us to do, because we've got like 120 students a year that have got to do a project, and lots of them are international students, and lots of them want to do something about sexual health and HIV, and a lot of them end up doing something which is kind of pointless, because if you say, look, actually, these 10 things are what we want you to do, that is ideal for us, it's ideal for impact, it's ideal for you, because do you know what I mean? Everybody gets kind of what they want. And it also makes it real as well. So, and then that meant that Waverley Care got something useful that they were actually interested in. And so it wasn't just about giving back afterwards, it was about doing what you needed. Yeah.
What you're organizing. I had to have really focused conversations with her, which wouldn't normally happen for MSc at work.
Yeah.
I had to meet her and decide, am I going to root for you? And then to go to the organisation and meet with them and say, what do you think? And to look for work for me personally, more than I wanted particularly, but what everyone got from it so worth it.
Yeah.
From and a model really of how to do this, but it was a lot of work to speak, even though everyone wanted it, to make it happen took a lot more than how to structure. And the next thing is to say that it doesn't operate for community, it doesn't operate for that over there, it's operating for MSc and whatever. It's fine, but on the other hand, if you really want to do it, you have to go back and think through on structure.
Yeah, no, I think definitely when students, because I just had an email the other day from a student who said that she wanted to do research on sexual health, but she was really open to like seeing what we wanted, and that was great. So fantastic. I can think about where that could slot in, as opposed to what I usually get is that proposal that's been through ethics, but it's like a plain language statement and that's it. And it's sort of rarely is it something that feels kind of applicable to our work. Whereas if students contact us right at the start, we can work with it.
I'd say that we could even go a step further than that, where we say, what do you want? And
I mean, Edinburgh do that. I've just done a couple of forms for Edinburgh.
Because at the moment we do have stuff that our master's students get at the beginning. We say, right, these are the things we're interested in doing. And also there wouldn't necessarily be the expectation that, if it didn't work out, it wouldn't be, you have to, you've agreed from the beginning by saying this, that you're just going to get anyone that we can palm off on you. But that would be great, but maybe I'll email you about that.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think that trust dimension, because I think about it, even when I was thinking about the student email the other day and sort of where that could fit in, and I think, would I want to sort of leave that in a student's hands? But then that obviously takes a lot of labour from your side, I guess, to work with. Well, it sounds like it did to get
And I
rid
was
of students like that.
slow, to be honest. Because the relationships that came from that piece of work, I've still got them with all the really care with the students. We've now done for PhD related to the PhD, SRC PhD, the project related to it. It's just, but that's a relationship. There's only so many that can actually have, because that's a lot. I have my relationship with her and others like it. There's only so many.
But it's also worth, when you look at these kinds of students, they're not students who doesn't know anything. You're telling them you've got a pharmacist who's got 10 years experience, you've got a senior nurse, a social worker, with, they're not, 18 and bright-eyed, they're, world smart. And some of them aren't. Some of them are really I haven't got a clue, but yeah.
Are there any comments on Twitter, Lewis? No comments, just me tweeting. One of the things I wanted to ask, and I was going to take note of, is actually the increased demands we place on people from certain communities. So we say as an academic, we want to include people in our, not just our interviews, but we want them to be a part of the project, we want it to be collaborative. But actually, how do you do that? How do you bring community members, however we're defining them, into a room with academics, with maybe healthcare practitioners, where the power dynamics are really wildly varied? And actually, are we expecting, I've been in rooms where people have been, I think it can be quite an intimidating space. I think it can be quite.
You can go in there as a senior researcher with PhDs and still find it an intimidating space. So
I think
yeah.
it's not coming up with a language we all have in common, that we are able to speak to each other and work with each other. And I think that's about relationship building. It's also about language. So I wonder if anyone has suggestions about how do you manage?
Well, I have to do with cross on this sector, cultural sector, and it was about basically that was practitioners, artistic practitioners of colour, community of colour, senior decisions, strategic governance people in the major cultural organisations in Scotland, museums and galleries, Scotland, about. It's about representation. So we thought it creates confidence there. And so we were to have a conversation. And I usually think on the long table, which is got loads of leaders and artists, the person who it is, and it's a process of managing our proposals around experience. You need a facilitator, you need basically set up like a long table, big focus, invited to from the conversation, facilitate and manage, and people sit around it, so it's nearly like a bit of theatre. I'm actually going to be using it as a centre for population, does some population health event that I'm doing. I don't know how to use it, but it's exactly what this is around power differentials and how to manage that in order for people to be heard.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. So, but it's Lois Weaver. Okay. That's great. That's really helpful. Thank you.
My one that I use.
I don't know what time it is actually.
13
minutes. Okay. So, any other comments or questions that people want to raise, or any arguments people want to have? Ruth.
I don't have an argument. I'm just always really fascinated by
Oh, go on.
by the comment that
Well, I think that is also linked to discourses about power. Is it's just by definition, without being particularly specific, we know already that for women it's much more difficult to even be part of a research project because majority of women have children. They cannot afford the luxury of have some quality time with a researcher. Some of my work has been, well, part of the work I have done has been with so-called disadvantaged communities, Roma women, sex workers, in particular stateless women, women who don't have rights in so many different ways. But if I can see a commonality between all the women I have met as a researcher and the women I have met as in inverted commas a community member in other settings, there are the point where women meet is that there is a lack of agency and power compared to men. I did do a lot of interviews with men as well. Men living, I just completed a piece of work interviewing male sex workers who are much more able to enjoy the time to spend with me because they don't have children, maybe they don't have, they perceive or they have the luxury of their time in a different way compared to women. But something else also that for me is particularly important is because I can locate myself geographically and culturally in so many different places, and I can give you the example of living in Scotland, research in Scotland, also being Italian and research in Italy, and being Croatian and being in Croatia. So I'm already in 3 different places, but the space of women in these different geographical and cultural spaces are already different in terms of agency and power compared to the space that men could have. And I'm not talking about, well, I don't want to make assumptions and generalize the male and the female, but it's more about the opportunity afforded to men and women when it comes to their own voices. When we think about the HIV community, for instance, we usually say, well, the majority of people affected or living with HIV are men, but there are also women as a kind of a nice accessory, as someone would have a nice handbag. So there are always women attached to any discourse. And even when we talk about female sex workers, we then say, and there is plenty of research on this, where scholars are talking to sex workers, they're listening to the voices of sex workers, but then they make assumptions which are very much within discourses, both in terms of language and academic discourses, which are very much male orientated, dominated, infused, depending on where you're locating yourself. But every time you do research as a woman, at one point you're asked to locate yourself in one way or another. It's not the same for men, never. I'm kind of simplifying this, but it happens. Think about, for instance, I used to use quite a lot of case studies in my work because it's quite useful in some instances, and then I can also use that with in my teaching. The way in which we think about the methodology of case study research is very much about the language is very much male, the male oriented. We use a case study, even if it's about women or about a woman, but the language and the way in which we explain case study research is very much male spoken. And we have to kind of explain at the beginning that we are women, that we talk with the language is different. And specifically, and I'm going back to what I said earlier about hating the word community, specifically, if you're a woman belonging by choice or by necessity or by accident to different communities, then you have to explain all the time why you're in that community and what you're doing in that community. It doesn't happen to men. And I can say this because I have done a lot of research with men. Men do not need to justify their belonging, women do.
Yes.
Can I ask you a question about the difference in the ethics medical practices? If you're looking at a group of individuals or a community that are in prison compared to that group of people that might be out of that environment, what we might need to consider.
But when it's a very good question for different reasons, because my experience, so I'm talking very much from my own experience, my experience of doing research in prison is that everyone is always very forthcoming because it's a reason or an opportunity to talk to as simple as that. And but there are differences which are not that subtle when you do research in prison, because again, it's very much about how people. Again, I'm talking from my experience, but I'm going to say something about something else in a minute. When I do research in prison in Italy, and I've done a lot of research, my Italian is very posh. So as much as I try to be friendly, and I use this as a very bizarre way, with people I interact when I have access to prison, I always come across as the researcher. When I do research using English as a way of communicating, because I've got a funny accent, people find it quite funny sometimes, because sometimes I have a kind of slightly Scottish accent, but then I turn into an Italian accent, or depends. So it's quite endearing in a way, and that helps already building a rapport. So my way of communicating with people in English is much more beneficial for me as someone who wants to write a research paper, but also for them because they talk to me in a different way. There is also a complete different relation I have with people because I'm fluent in Croatian because of my own biography, which means that I can locate myself also in so many other geographical and cultural places in Eastern Europe. But because I speak Croatian, when I speak then Slovenian, I have a strange accent, and because of the culture and the strange relationship between, for instance, Slovenia and Croatia, or many other Eastern European countries, when I do work in prison, my way of doing research, or the way in which I perceive, is completely different. What I want to say as well is that there is, stemming from the US, but very much now in the UK, there is now a plethora of studies putting forward by scholars who call themselves convict criminologists, those who have been in prison, meaning that they are the ones who are able to do research with those who have been incarcerated. And that is a completely different way of looking at prison. And I have just completed a draft of a paper comparing the same kind of interviews done by myself, that I've never been in prison as someone who's been convicted of a crime, but I worked in a prison setting since the early 80s, and someone who has been in prison as convicted of a crime and now works in academia. And the way in which finds out is that prisoners relate to myself and my colleague who's a male in a different way because of our gender, not because of our experience of being incarcerated. But that's just a short experience.
I think I'd love that, and that's not really my experience, but my colleagues. She talks about you have to, if you're getting people that are in prison and you want them to take part in your research, you have to consider the opportunities for doing anything else that they have. And so the issue of kind of consent is slightly different when there aren't really very many interesting things coming along in your day and somebody wants you to do this. So it's kind of a bit like stuff that we used to do with rent boys, who wanted to be called rent boys, not sex workers, that we had an issue, an ethical issue around payment, because when we were interviewing them, if we paid them, they turned up, but they didn't really want to do an interview. They didn't really want to participate, but it was that or getting fucked. They'd rather come and sit there and have a cup of tea and not talk to me. You need to consider about the ethical issue of, are you actually, is that person really consenting, or have they just got nothing else, not nothing else to do, but literally nothing else to do, and so they kind of have to do the research.
But that, sorry, but that is similar to what happens, and I'm relating to my own personal experience, when you go to your HIV clinic and there is a nurse or someone that puts a piece of paper in front of you, and you have to, well, it's not really about consent, but if you don't consent, you might think that they're not going to help you, they're going to treat you in a different way, or some kind of coerced consent.
That's true, but you wouldn't always have in an ethics committee approval where it would clearly say that that wouldn't happen. If it had gone through my ethics committee, believe me, that would have to say that. But I think it is different from this, where if you're an HIV positive person going to clinic, that doesn't necessarily mean you've got nothing else on that day, but you've probably got loads of other things on that day, whereas in prison.
Except that the moment in which you enter the HIV clinic, you're not a person who has a job, or a person who has a lover, or a person who has to pay the mortgage. At that time, you're only a person living with HIV.
So that's just NHS though, isn't it?
No, I don't know about the NHS.
I think my experience of NHS is like, once you get in there, you just have to stay until they have to treat you.
I don't think it's the NHS because it's
well, I do. Yeah.
Well, it's just because
in my experience,
I am talking from my experience in Italy as well. So in Italy, the system is completely different. But at the moment you are in the HIV clinic, that's who you are and nothing else. So it doesn't really matter if you have.
I think that's definitely my experience of any NHS. You're there, you're patient.
Yeah.
I'm going to draw this to a close because people have to leave.
Yeah.
I don't know how to turn this off, but
I'll do it.
what I'd really like to do is thank the three fantastic speakers. Thank you very much. We'll try and improve our technical next time. Thank you very much. It's been a great discussion.
Research proposal. I have to stand beside.
Oh,
I'm so sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you for everyone listening.
Before we go, can I just say hello people around the world? Who you are. I'm 70,000. I'm the events lead for IRESH. I'd really like feedback from people who weren't here, who followed us on the webcam, and let us know, did it work? Was it good? Would you like us to do more of these kinds of things? Was it awful? No, they tell us if it was awful.
Well, do tell us, because we won't bother.
Yeah, do tell us if it was awful. What we want to do as So it would be really helpful for us as a team to know whether you want us to do this anymore. So thank you.
Okay, I don't.
I'll stop. I'll do that.
And you can gracefully exit.
Yeah. Thank you.
Please take some food. I'm not going to take it.
Oh, I've licked all the nuts. Sorry.
Yeah.